I want to unlock the potential in people to do really amazing things. Really, it wasn't the product that was a problem, it was the culture. People are their hugest asset. My job is to unleash that drive and that motivation. But I'm going to expect all of you to figure out the right way to achieve those goals. We now live in a world where hybrid meetings are the norm, not the exception. The spaces get used more because the employees they involved in the process know the spaces are there to do. Did you accomplish what you set out to accomplish today? Why or why not? But they've invested in really nice spaces in different ways. You don't need a policy, you need guidelines. If you just said that, most people would be like, yeah, that probably makes sense. The team that I was on wanted to stay closer to the center of action. We're going to have to rethink the purposes of space for different business units. Everybody at the C-suite then goes, well, yeah, of course. Great. Now you understand why there's not a uniform rule of 3 to 4 days a week. The ability to bring people together from diverse perspectives, diverse functions, diverse needs, and align them around goals, but also develop understanding of each other was really essential to driving performance.
For decades, we've measured the workplace by efficiency, cost per square foot, utilization, and occupancy. But times have changed. The real story isn't about how efficiently we use space, but why we use it. What if the office is one of the most powerful leadership tools we have, where storytelling, culture, collaboration, and performance come together to drive strategic goals? Welcome to What the F is Happening to the Office, where we explore how the workplace and the issues that surround it are evolving. Hi, I'm Bob Fox, founder of Work Design, and in each episode, we talk with the experts who are shaping the future of work. Leaders, designers, and innovators who are redefining how and where we work. If you're interested in learning more about the workplace of the future, be sure to subscribe and share with others who are using or shaping our work environments. Your comments and suggestions will help us to bring you more conversations with the people changing the places where we work. Today, we're joined by Brian Elliott, CEO of WorkForward, Senior Advisor with Boston Consulting Group, best-selling author of How the Future Works, and publisher of the Flux Index. After 25 years at companies like Google and Slack, Brian now helps organizations rethink work with a mix of research, data, and practical experience. He's one of Forbes' Future of Work 50 and a leading voice on workplace transformation. Brian, welcome. It's great to have you here to share your insights with us.
Bob, thanks for having me. Great to be here with you as well. Been looking forward to this.
Before we get into the conversation, tell us a little bit about what led you to start WorkForward and the Flex Index.
Sure. So you always sort of figure out, at least I figured out my career in retrospect, not as I went through it, right? So I am a lifelong learner, avid, seeker of new experiences and new insights and ways of working. And over the course of 25 years leading in tech, the thing I figured out looking backwards is that old phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast, is one that I wholeheartedly believe and embrace. It's what I learned in my startup days when I went from being, a salesperson basically to being the CEO of a startup and then founding 2 other companies. The ability to bring people together from diverse perspectives, diverse functions, diverse needs, and align them around goals, but also develop understanding of each other was really essential to driving performance. I did the same thing when Google hired me. I got handed a product that I was told was a problem. And really, it wasn't the product that was a problem. It was the culture. Same thing at Slack. And in 2020, I got the opportunity to do something a little bit different. And I founded a think tank called Future Forum. Happened to be at the start of the pandemic. Happened to be when we're all going through this, kind of insanely bad, but also insightful time around where and how people were working. And sort of jumping forward, 5 years of research, both work that we did at Future Forum, work I've done with other partners, as well as now acquiring last year the Flex Index, which is the source of sort of workplace policy data for about 14,000 companies globally. I've developed a lot of insights into what's working and what's not for people and organizations, but also enough understanding to know that every organization is unique, and it's much more about how you build effective cultures at work than almost anything else if you really want to be successful. So that's the nickel version of it.
You're swimming in a lot of data, and I get the sense that there are so many different aspects to that it's not necessarily about remote or hybrid or in the office, that
Yeah.
there's a bigger conversation that we're missing in corporate America. Can you give us some insight into what that should be?
Yeah. The heart of it really is, what's your talent strategy? And it's a bit of mindset, which is, are you what's sometimes referred to as a system X thinker? Someone who is thinking about your employees as you need to control them, you need to monitor them, you need to set rewards in front of them so they follow the train of rewards in order to get performance out of them. Or are you a system Y thinker that says people actually have internal motivations, they have drive, and my job is to unleash that drive and that motivation in the right ways, aimed at a set of goals in order to get the most out of them? That's the most fundamental thing, actually, that sits underneath a lot of these conversations, that sort of need for control and monitoring of humans because they might do something bad, versus, is my orientation, I want to unlock the potential in people to do really amazing things. And I'm going to give them some latitude while also making sure that they're actually hitting their numbers to do it. And I think that sits underneath a lot of things that then become squabbles, a lot of noise. And the whole, return to office, fully remote versus fully in office, is certainly one of those.
Trying to find the right people too has got to be critical, in terms of that, achieving that success.
That's right. That's right. And I've worked with organizations. I just actually last week was with a very large 30,000 person organization that has physical plant operations. They've got R&D labs. They've got salespeople. They've got a corporate headquarters with the usual sort of IT, finance, and HR staffs. The belief that they've got broadly is that people are their hugest asset, right? And they want to hire highly talented people. They want to hold them accountable for performance. And they also know that at the size and scope of an organization like that, there's no one size fits all rule that says, here is the model that we believe works for everybody when it comes to things like number of days a week that you need to be in the office. And that's one of the things that always puzzles me about this conversation in the first place. And any organization, by the way, past some minimum scale, has teams that are already distributed across locations. If we spent more time thinking about how we make people effective managers of distributed teams, we would be much better off as organizations. But I think that is part of the challenge as well, is we just don't invest in leadership skills in the way that we should if we wanted to get better results.
Yeah. And I also feel like there's a void in leadership. The leaders aren't really stepping up to say, here's where we need to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Or they are, and they're doing it in a way that is very much a my way is the right way and the only way to do it. Right. And so you get people confusing the need for high aspirations with the needs to tell you how to achieve those aspirations very specifically. Right. So you get the senior experienced CEO who may, by the way, Bob, look like you and I. It's a slightly older gentleman, almost always white, who grew up through a system that rewarded him pretty well for putting his nose to the grindstone, let's face it. And the way in which he put the nose to the grindstone was he was in the office every day from 7 until 7. And so that is the model for success that he had personally. Therefore, he thinks that's the right model for success broadly, and he tends to apply it to everybody. I think the broader leadership challenge is, how do I set those high aspirations, those high expectations for a team? How do I point to the goal, but enlist people in getting there, right? How do I say, look, I know we can achieve this. This is going to be hard. It won't be easy to do. I'm going to support you in terms of the training and the tools. I'm going to give you access to office space. I'm going to give you access to technology. I'm going to hire really smart, capable leaders at the mid-level, but I'm going to expect all of you to figure out the right way to achieve those goals. I'm going to hold you accountable to the performance against those goals, but I'm not going to tell you explicitly how to do it, because I think I hired some really smart people. I think I hired some really capable people that I expect to bring their teams together to make those goals a reality.
So we hire people for their brains, and we should let them use their brains.
Probably a good idea. Yeah.
You bring a pretty diverse background, and I'm curious to get your perspective on the physical workplace. And we went through the pandemic and we had opportunities. What did we realize, or what did we miss going through that?
Yeah, I'll give you, like, dial your head back. I worked in startups. I worked at Google. I worked in places that had really awful workspaces and places that are really great ones. I mean, Google has always invested really heavily in high quality space. We also did this thing where we jammed more and more people into less and less space. When I first joined a team at Google, I actually had a 36-inch desk. I'm not kidding. And it was because the team that I was on wanted to stay closer to the center of action. So they traded off staying in a building where they had to basically densify the crud out of it. No one could get work done at their desks in that space. It was just way too packed and noisy and cacophonous. And I think, there's a set of trade-offs that some firms are making. One of the biggest things I see out there today from a workplace perspective is there are workplace leaders who are aligned with their leadership team about the direction they're headed, about the ROI on investing in space, regardless of the model, regardless of whether they're full-time in office or hybrid or remote. And they're finding ways to put in place spaces that work for their team. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Zoom, everybody lost their minds when Zoom said 2 days a week in the office would be a great thing to do a couple of years ago, right? Because that was the end of remote work. It's like, y'all, 2 days a week. If Zoom had said that in 2018, it would have been, a remote revolution. But they've invested in really nice spaces in different ways. Like in London, they've got a customer-oriented center that actually shows customers what the art of the possible is in workspaces in terms of digital interaction. It's also got great space for employees to come in. And people do because they want to interact with the customers. And so the customers become a magnet and bring people in. And the space is well designed. And you can find a room to have a meeting with your team, right? And they've thought about what it's for. If you look at Atlassian and what they've done, they've redesigned their spaces to be very modular. So they can actually literally have ops people or even a team move desks around if they want to reconfigure, because this month we're going to have more teams coming in to do events and fewer people needing heads down space. The people that are investing behind that are getting better results because they're talking and listening to, it's what Janet Pogue has talked about, which is they're actually enlisting their customers, their employees in the conversation about what is it that we need. In doing that, they actually not only design better spaces, but the spaces get used more because the employees they involved in the process know the spaces are there to do, right? And so you get that working really well. The other side of the equation is unfortunate. The other side of the equation is workplace leaders who are frozen in place. And there are way too many of these folks because they know they need to redesign the spaces, that what worked in 2018 doesn't work in 2025, that people are complaining that they're being asked to come back into space where they can't find the place to do heads down, quiet work or to take enough calls because they're all jammed back into the open office floor plans. But senior leadership isn't aligned on what's going to happen, right? Senior leadership is not certain they want to shrink office space or keep it. They might change their minds about return to office mandates, and they certainly aren't thinking about the ROI on space design. And the challenge is those ones that are ahead are going to keep iterating and learning, right? Like I did this with the PagerDuty team, talked about what they did in Toronto and how they took what they learned there and applied it to Lisbon and then applied it to Atlanta. So they're continuing to evolve and grow and improve while, half to 2/3 of workplace leaders are unfortunately stuck because they're not aligned up with their executive leadership on what's the ROI on higher quality, more effective space that might be also smaller footprint.
You talk about alignment. Can you share with us a little bit more of why that's so important, and what happens when it's not there?
I think the challenge with alignment is, you've got a group of senior leaders, even in most of the larger firms that have pushed on return to office, where the leadership group itself is not fully aligned. And so I'll give you a case study. One firm in particular where the chief revenue officer and the CEO decided that, we really need to be pushing people to be back in the office more often. We really think 4 or 5 days a week in the office is the right thing. Meanwhile, the CFO had also made the case quite strongly that a lot of the space was underutilized, had been underutilized for years. And given our financial performance, we just need to shrink footprint. And so what you find, lo and behold, is that, you end up with this workplace leader who's then stuck between a rock and a hard place. Who's my customer? I report to the CFO. And so therefore, I know who my boss is. I know what I'm being told to do, but I'm being yelled at by a sales leader who's then saying, you've got enough space for me in corporate headquarters, but all my other locations, I can't get people back in enough. And that lack of alignment, is just a bad spot to put people in. The other side of it, of course, is just you get the lack of understanding. Another case study that I'm hopefully going to publish in the next week is a large conglomerate sort of media company where it's got different business units. And the C-suite thought that there was one rule that should apply to everybody, that 3 days or 4 days a week was the right rule. And actually what helped and how the workplace leader got alignment is she worked with the individual business unit leaders to basically build out stories that would help them understand why different business units had different needs, why the one business unit that had a very much customer-centric point of view that was about being at the customer, being with the customer. Therefore, their employees are almost never in the office. Why would you ever expect them to be in 3 or 4 days a week? And then the other side is, here's another group where the client comes to us. And by the way, all of our people need offices because it's about the show. And so all of them need offices with a door because that's part of the brand. And presenting those stories and helping, everybody at the C-suite then goes, well, yeah, of course. Great. Now you understand why there's not a uniform rule of 3 to 4 days a week. And here's how we're going to do this. We're going to have to rethink the purposes of space for different business units. We're going to have to think about our portfolio of assets as well and how we approach this. But that alignment takes work, right? It took data gathering, it took storytelling, it took bringing those group of leaders together to do it in a way that otherwise the sort of glib, well, all of our peers are saying 4 days a week, so therefore 4 must be the number, doesn't accomplish.
You talk about the leaders and command and control policies. And, I think there's a shift that's swinging back towards that. And, how should workplace leaders respond to that?
So the shift overall, let's just tackle that part of it first, is kind of sad in some ways because command and control and the same leaders saying that they want agility are kind of funny, right? Like it's the Elon Musk led, switch. A couple of years back, I've worked in tech for 25 years. When Elon fired 80% of the employees at Twitter and the site didn't die, yeah, sure, revenue may have gone down by 70% and it may have had a bunch of bugs, but it didn't die. So therefore, if Elon can do that, I can fire 20% and not be, nearly as mean as Elon, right? So it shifted the narrative. I think Elon also, has pounded the table on return to office and everybody needs to be back in the office. Mind you, which office Elon happens to be the CEO of several different organizations, and I'm not sure which office he shows up in, but we'll set that aside. But that shift back towards my way or the highway is showing up in a lot of different ways, right? It's the I have all the answers type of mentality. And the challenge with that is it hasn't historically worked for organizations. You really want to decentralize the decision-making. Again, it's back to if you think about how growth happens in a dynamic, fast-changing environment, it's not going to be through the CEO setting a single, way of doing work. I think where command and control gets problematic for workplace leaders is they often get saddled with a job that is not their job, which is attendance, right? So there's too many workplace leaders still that sitting here in 2025 are being held accountable for how many days a week people are showing up in the office. And that's putting them in a really hard place because they aren't the manager. They aren't the leader of those organizations. And I know through our research and the work we've done with Nick Bloom, for example, that just because you say 5 days a week in the office doesn't mean you get it, or 4 or 3, right? On average, by the way, you get about 2/3 of whatever the number is that you say. And it gets worse the further out you go. And in part, that's because, you're probably not counting things the correct way. You may not be looking at customer visits or vacation days or sick leave, but it's more materially because leaders and managers, when faced with, do I fire Ben because Ben only shows up in the office, 2 days a week instead of 4, but Ben is a good performer and I've got really high, expectations and goals that have been put on me. Yeah, I'm not going to fire Ben. It's just not going to happen. And the threat, I had this with a group of real estate CEOs the other day. someone said, we just need to tell them that we're going to do things like, you can't get promoted if you're not in the office and not complying. So in today's job market, the reason why you're seeing more of these things happen is because the job market kind of sucks, right? It's harder to find another job. It's hard to get promoted. Well, if nobody's getting promoted anyway, and you're saying, I'm not going to get promoted if I don't commute 5 days a week to be in the office. And by the way, commuting costs me money and time, and it makes me less effective. I'll do it 2 days a week, but not 5. It's just not, the sticks aren't big enough, to be honest. And unfortunately, in most of those cases, they're thinking about sticks and not carrots.
I want to go back. You were talking about the stories people should tell about their teams and the work that they're doing. And I feel like the work environment is this immersive experience that we go through, and that leaders have the opportunity to convey the story, the history, how to serve the client, all the achievements that they've done. I'm thinking that that's an opportunity that leaders have really to use that space as a tool to communicate what the goals are. So, from your perspective, how do you look at that space and how can leaders use that to align their organizations?
Yeah, I think this is, again, where that space and the design of that space, in order to build that sort of culture and honestly a set of relationships, is really key. Ryan Anderson at Miller Knoll is a friend of mine and fantastic on this stuff. Again, Janet Pogue Gensler and I have talked about this as well. Like, part of the challenge, I'll dial back to this same firm I was with last week. Back when everybody was, full-time in the office, a big chunk of the challenge that people were facing is, I see the team that I see every day all the time because that's the floor we're on, but I don't interact with anybody. I'm in finance, but I don't interact with anybody in HR or marketing or engineering or anything else because I go to my floor and I see the same people over and over again. And so it doesn't matter even that you're in the same building, you vaguely, if ever, interact. Versus, there was a person who'd been at another firm and said, yeah, well, we basically blew out stairwells, right? We built out, and this is the stuff that's pretty common in a lot of workplaces these days, but unfortunately it's still too rare in others, big open areas with stairwells between floors. And, other workplace leaders have done things that make it so it is more dynamic. Not all of finance sits on the same floor. You're spread among 2 or 3 floors. So are 2 other functions. Yes, it is slightly inefficient for you to go and talk to Jane, who's in, the FP&A when you're in treasury, because you're on 2 or 3 different floors, but you're going to walk a stairwell, and maybe you're going to go to the kitchen, and maybe you two will meet up there. And by the way, maybe you'll meet up with somebody else from HR. Maybe you'll see somebody from engineering in that space. And so the design of space and how we actually get people throughout the flow of their day to interact with each other is part of what gives that vibe. The other part is just making sure that you've got spaces so that people can do the team interaction, which is largely what they're there to do in the first place. So, I've worked with a number of teams where, especially for like sales organizations, thinking about what am I going to do so that my people learn from each other is a big deal. And some of that, like for inside salespeople, may be that they're, sitting in a common area so they hear each other and they get the vibe. But other folks on things like, I want you to do pitch practice sessions. I need the space to actually have people hear each other practice doing the pitch. I want to bring in customers. Therefore, I need spaces so that customers are coming in and so my teams get a chance to interact with them. All of those activities are much more focused on the sort of relationship and collaboration side of the equation now in the sort of 70% plus case versus the 70%, heads down workspaces that we, built out for decades. And that takes money. The problem is it takes money. It at the end of the day, it's an investment that you have to decide you're going to make.
Yeah, you mentioned efficiency, and for years, I think as long as I can remember, we've measured space on cost and efficiency metrics. And I think the conversation's changed.
Yeah.
The way that we're thinking about space and the way that space is being used now is very different.
Yeah.
So what are those metrics? How should we be looking at the way that we measure space?
One that's interesting to me is she's now at CBRE, but Annie Dean, when she was at Atlassian, started building out cost per event. So she wanted to stop thinking about like just the straightforward, what's my cost per square foot and what's my utilization. and start thinking about cost per event, because then she could think about very different models on a location by location basis, as well as being able to think about how you would use flexible space providers too, as opposed to just the sort of traditional leased environment. And so thinking about that in terms of how over time am I reshaping my portfolio so that for every event, whether that's someone who needs heads down workspace 5 days a week, or whether it's small team gatherings, I've got a way in which I'm actually putting a cost yardstick that's a little bit more apples to apples across different types of experiences. And then I'm going to bounce that out with another really big one, which is what's this doing in terms of employee engagement, right? And some of that is user satisfaction with space, but it is also like how are people feeling when they leave? Zillow has a centralized team that oversees and helps implement several hundred events per year across the company. But they've spent 4 years building this out, and they built it out on the fact that every time you come into one of their offices, you get a poll. You get a very short Slack notification that says, hey, please take the survey. And the survey asks you, yes, about the quality of the experience, but it also asks you, did you accomplish what you set out to accomplish today? Why or why not? If you were there for an event, what was the event? Did it accomplish its goals? What was the agenda like? And so that what they're doing is they're using that as a workplace team to get a sense of not only, were you satisfied with the facilities, but were you more importantly satisfied with the experience that you had? And then what can they mine out of that to make the experience better, not just from a facility standpoint, but also from the standpoint of like, some of our managers are really good at hosting team meetings. Some of them could use some help. I'll give you one of the things they found, which was if you're doing like team, quarterly team gathering, a 50-50 blend of business-oriented topics and social connection works out really well. We all know people that do the 100% business-oriented, right? Death by PowerPoint. I also know some firms that have tried to do the 100% social, which is great the first time you do it, but after a while, it kind of wears thin. So they've figured out through, continual surveying, what works and what doesn't. And so I think this is a broadening in a major way of the job of workplace leaders, but it's going very dramatically from a traditional, what's my yardstick of square footage per head, desks per head cost, to what's my cost to deliver an experience and what's the quality of the experience that I'm delivering.
Well, it's almost looking at it, there's an intangible to it versus the cost. What's the value that I'm getting out of it, which is mostly, probably an intangible benefit.
And to some degree, it's always been an intangible benefit in the sense that we just assumed that everybody needed an office in order to get their job done. So therefore, the objective to some degree, unfortunately, was like, make it nice enough in a lot of cases to be passable and plausible, but we're going to value engineer out as much cost as we possibly can in order to, keep the cost low because the CFO is looking over our shoulder. If instead you can sit there and say, hey, look, this is a really important tool for teams, but it is not something that we have to provide 24/7 to everybody on an ongoing basis. Well, then I can probably shrink the total amount of it that I need, but I can probably crank up the quality of what I've got, of what I provide, and come out, net even, if not slightly better. And if I can do that with a portfolio over the course of 5 years, then I've really, what I'm doing is I'm building an engine that gets continually better on doing it, as opposed to I'm stamping out the same thing I've been doing for a decade plus, which is a spot where I think some firms got stuck.
Well, even before the pandemic, I think that utilization was less than 50% on a good day.
Yeah. And that surprised the heck out of most people. But it did. Like, I was at Slack, right? And at Slack, late 2020, early 2021, when when we started thinking about, hey, it's time to reopen the office, head of workplace comes and says, average utilization of desks was about 50%. And the CEO goes, that can't be true. You must have. And by the way, he's not an office-centric guy. He's just like, that can't be true. It was always busy. It was always a buzz. And she's like, no, that's absolutely true. And you look at JLL data, CBRE data, anybody else is out there, right? Maybe 55, maybe 60. Some industries and firms more than others. But if you're in financial services, tech, most big companies, you probably weren't better than 55% desk utilization.
Yeah. Tell us about the Flex Index and how that can be used to help shape workplace strategy decisions.
Yeah. So Flex Index, we track about 9,000 US based companies and about 14,000 around the globe in terms of their workplace flexibility policies. So where do you sit on, where's your company sit on the spectrum of, fully remote? Employee choice meaning you have an office, but there's no central policy. What flavor of hybrid do you have, and then versus full time in office? We use that to just sort of generate insights that I think are helpful on a couple dimensions. One is just broadly the headline narrative. The stories get written by, as Nick Bloom has put it, it's Sharkbite Media, right? It's the CEO who comes out and does something that his employees don't like, that cranks up in particular the demand for 5 days a week. And if you read just the headlines, then you would believe that everybody was going back to full-time in-office work. And what our data shows is that's not true. Even if you just look at policies of what companies are doing, 5 days a week went from like 32% 2 years ago to 34% today. And literally half of that change is government entities. It's the Trump administration and certain states, largely Republican controlled, that pushed it the hardest. But if you look at what is happening under the hood, you're seeing sort of a centralization towards 3 days a week as being sort of the default model in a lot of organizations, but also a lot of variation. And so the second thing that people use it for is they start using the index. You can go to flexindex.com. You can play around with the data. You can look up specific companies. You can read our reports. And what you'll find is like there are ways in which you want to be able to look at it by industry, by size of company, by location. And so understanding who your competitors are, what they're doing, and what you generally find in every industry is that there are people who are playing on very different ends of the spectrum of this, right? You've got, AT&T is pushing for people to be back in the office 5 days a week. And Verizon is happily using that to recruit away data scientists from AT&T because they're staying, firmly in the hybrid. I think they're either at 2 or 3 days a week is their base level. But it's a form of competition for talent. And so workplace leaders can use this to help understand what the policies are for people in their area, for people in their industry, and use that as part of this. How do I get alignment with the executives? Because back to my story earlier, often the executives have a singular narrative in their heads when, the data would say that's not really the case.
I often see a lot of confusion between actual behavior and the policies that are written. And a lot of times the policies are more confusing than helpful. So I'm wondering if there's a way to help sort through that.
Yeah. And I think that the problem basically comes down in some ways to, is the policy really something that's a mandate? And if so, and you're trying to apply it to everybody, there's a big question why, right? Is this really the thing that's going to move the needle? I was having this conversation with somebody earlier today who said, hybrid is a problem. I said, well, why is hybrid a problem? Well, hybrid is a problem because people don't comply. So, but you're still not giving me an answer here. You're not telling me, now we're on to a different problem, which is why is compliance a problem, right? And so what you get into then very quickly is all the challenges of a larger organization where a singular policy creates more noise than solution. So when Jamie Dimon said, I want everybody back 5 days a week, and there was the person who protested wasn't griping over work-life balance. He was saying, hey, I manage a team of IT leaders that are located in different cities. They don't work in the same city, let alone the same building. Could I have a little latitude? And the answer from Jamie was, no, you cannot. And there's no business logic behind it, right? There's just a no, you cannot. And so that's where I think that's where you run into challenge with these things. And yes, sometimes the policies can get really intricate below that, like this unit, this group, this thing over here. The better answer still consistently is make sure that leaders are having the conversations with their teams. Most people want to be together with their team 2 or 3 days a week, especially if they're co-located. Great. It's then on the leader to say, hey, which days of the week are we coming into the office and what are we doing on those days? That would be a good cause for coming in. Back to my sales example, pipeline review or pitch practice sessions with folks. If you can do that, you don't need a policy. You need guidelines. You need like, hey, company-wide We expect people to live within a commutable distance to the office because we expect you and your leader to figure out like which days of the week you're in the office. We think for teams that are co-located, that's going to be 2 or 3 days a week, but you and your leader figure it out. If you just said that, most people would be like, yeah, that probably makes sense. And you're giving the leader the latitude to say, hey, everybody, I need to bring us together because a complete free-for-all doesn't work. I need to actually give you some days of the week that we're going to be in the office together as a team. Great. Then you've checked the box on something. But policy, unfortunately, tends to be written in a way that is about compliance as opposed to enablement.
I'm curious, I'm thinking as I'm listening to you that, I'm wondering if there's an alignment between organizational performance, successfully communicated policies that are adhered to, and talent attraction and retention.
Yeah. Yeah, there are. I'll give you one of the more extreme examples, which is Airbnb. Did some work with them last year. They were everyone choose your own adventure in some ways. Top-down mandates 4 or 5 days a week don't work very well. But honestly, complete individual choice with no framework also doesn't work very well because the collaboration tax is really high. So what they figured out is they had teams, especially like think about product development. So as they build for large launches, which they do twice a year, they have these sort of big teams of 80 to 100 people that are really core to those efforts. Those people are scattered all over the place. Expecting them to come into local offices 3 days a week probably wasn't going to work because there weren't enough offices local to them in the first place, and wouldn't solve the problem of how do we all interact. So they actually set up a system where those people come together once a month. About half of them fly into San Francisco for it. So once a month, they're in San Francisco for 3 days. And the trade-off there is you're going to get a 3-day in-office, deep immersion with each other, deep work, kickoffs, milestone reviews, really going deep onto the work, also social connection, meals together, other activities like that. You're going to do it once a month. We're going to tell you in advance that it's coming. But by the way, you're all going to do it. We expect you to do it. When they rolled this out, it was an invitation, right? Here's this thing. Here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to do it. It wasn't a mandate. And the reception from it was very much a thank you, not a, oh my God, you're telling me what to do, because it made sense. It was pre-planned. People got why they were doing it. And so that approach works really well. I think wrapping it around business logic, having it pertain to a group where it makes the most sense tends to work pretty well.
For architects and facility managers, what trends are you seeing in workplace design or technology that are the most impactful?
I will gladly confess I'm not the deepest expert on the joys of the architecture side of things. I do think that from an overall perspective, technology's place in the office continues to increase, right? And so what's the role of technology? How do you think about closing distances between groups? How do you think about designing rooms? Because like I ran a team at Google that was distributed back before we called it distributed. I had people in 8 different offices, plus a central group in Mountain View, California, where the people who were dialing in, who were usually 1 or 2 of them on the call, could never hear and could never get a word in edgewise. So we did some stuff. Obviously, at Google, they were doing some work around the facilities. We also did some stuff around rule sets. If someone on the call, on the video call, was trying to break in, you let them go. They get dibs. They get to go first. Someone at the front of the room would also be the monitor of those people on video to see if someone was trying to get in, so they would tell everybody else to shut up. But we now live in a world where hybrid meetings are the norm, not the exception. And so I think from a space perspective, we need to start thinking about what that design looks like. I've also talked to a lot of people back to the topic of relationships and culture. The design of space to be about the interaction between different people who don't usually and wouldn't usually run into each other, make everybody's life in the office slightly inconvenient, which is sort of the antithesis of some elements of like efficiency, but it's really important because in a lot of ways, when I'm coming into the office, that's not my most efficient day. And I don't want it to be my most efficient day. I want it to be a day where I'm building connections. And that's going to have implications for flow. It's going to have implications for signage so I can figure out where I'm trying to get to. It's going to have implications for technology because, I need to book a space and that space needs to be available to me. I need to actually be able to work that with my team. So there's a lot that's happening that has as much to do with like, how do I enable those experiences physically through technology and through sort of guidance for leaders that I think is reshaping how we think about what the office is in the first place.
I think of the physical work environment and the technology as tools that we have to help us get our work done. And
Yeah.
a lot of times those things aren't always thought of in an integrated way. There's a distinction between the physical space and the technology. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how we could do a better job of bringing that together.
Yeah, I think increasingly there's the need to think through things like, if I have to install the 15th app onto my phone in order to book a room, it's probably not going to happen. Most of those tools, though, like Cadence is a good example, you can access through your Outlook calendar, right? Or Teams or Slack, right? There's different ways you can do it. But I think the default is going to be go where the users are. The users are going to be sitting in your calendaring app, Google or Microsoft. They're going to be sitting in Slack and Teams in terms of engagement level. You're going to need to find a way that whatever it is you want your users to do from a workplace perspective physically to show up in those spots if you want users to have easy access to them and to be tapping on them. That can include things like not only booking a seat or booking a room, but it also includes things like, hey, I need help because the monitor is on the fritz here, right? So how do I escalate an issue and if I have to go and hunt for the 15th app to do it, it's just unlikely that's going to happen. The other is just like wayfinding in offices and the technology in place of wayfinding, which I think is increasingly important because people aren't coming back to the same space every day as often. And even when they were in some spaces without it, it was always slightly problematic when you had that meeting that was on the other floor that you didn't know what the naming convention was.
So I also feel like there's this tension between standardization, which I think most organizations strive for, and I think there's been an explosion in flexibility and choice. How do you balance those two different needs?
Yeah. So some of that comes back to standardization is often cheaper and makes people feel more familiar, but it might not meet the needs of different localities and different types of teams. Back to my Zoom example, they end up with different templates almost, customer-oriented spaces, collaboration-oriented spaces for employees, and then innovation spaces, which are more about like the new hardware, new forms of interaction because hardware engineers, need a different setup. So they've thought about it in terms of what are the needs of different types of areas, and then they start thinking about how they use that more broadly. In a lot of other places, the challenge becomes if every leader is basically able to figure out their own budget to hit their own, team offsite, and they're booking different hotels in different places and different flex facilities, then the bills get up really high. There are firms that have done a good job where the workplace leaders have said, hey, look, we're going to provide you with the following access to leased facilities for your teams on a regular basis. We're going to then work with a liquid space, a Gable, a Dasana to give you access to selected spaces that fit our criteria from a quality, cost, security perspective. And by the way, we're now building experiences that allow you as a leader to say, I want to book a space. And you don't necessarily know if it's a leased space or a flex space, depending on the city that you're going to. But you've got to have the willingness to invest in the technology and the rule set up top in your workplace leadership team to be able to do that. Because then what you're doing is saying, hey, look, I'm giving my leadership teams more flexibility because they need to be able to bring people together in Cleveland, and we don't have a facility in Cleveland. But I'm going to do it in a way in which I still have centralized control over how much you're spending in order to be able to do that. And we know you're doing it in a space that is secure, for example, as opposed to going to the Marriott and spending an arm and a leg or taking everybody to a coffee shop and having a problem.
AI is a huge topic these days, and I'm curious on how you see AI coming into the work environment and what kind of changes you see coming down the road.
Yeah, I mean, there's the broad and the narrow. The narrow from a workplace perspective and a facilities perspective is I actually think there's a lot of opportunity from an automation. The starting point is just better automation and tools for resolving end user issues in ways that keep your staff from being overwhelmed with staff in the call center as a starting point. The other is even simple things like contract administration and understanding what you have your hands on. I was at an event that Tracy Hawkins hosted at OpenAI, where they demoed their own workplace team's use of AI. And you can imagine facilities management being able to sit there and say, hey, look, I've got umpteen contracts in umpteen locations, right? I don't even know when some of them expire. I don't know, whether I'm allowed to do this, in which spaces am I allowed to do this and not do this? Like just the set of activities that just make it easier. So you're not like trying to turn to legal for help every single time to answer very basic questions. Those are sort of like the fundamentals. I do think AI is transformative. I'm definitely one of the people though that think it is currently overhyped in the short term and it's still going to be revolutionary in the long term. I just think that like everything else that we've ever done, it takes a decade for the combination of like, yeah, there's data issues that most companies have. There is, quality of the responses that you get from the technology, but the biggest one is change management, right? You don't, using AI to generate more sales emails, we've already seen the results of that. It's in your inbox. It's in my inbox. It doesn't result in more sales. It just results in more sales emails, right? You can use AI to write more lines of code. You then have to make sure those lines of code work inside of a big, complex environment and that it's actually what the customer wanted in the first place in order to build it. The more interesting stuff comes from how do you rethink workflows of how teams work that are multi-step in nature. And that takes time and effort because you have to step back and think consciously about something that's unconscious for most teams, which is how do we do work? And therefore, what are ways in which we could use AI to automate some steps of that, to take some of the load off of us? But it's usually the stuff between people that gets you the real value, not just the stuff that I'm doing as an individual user.
I think the workplace is becoming more and more complex. And I think there's more issues like health and well-being, sustainability, AI and technology that workplace leaders have to deal with. Any thoughts or suggestions? I mean, if somebody's just starting out with a major redesign of their workplace today, where do they begin? And what's one thing that you would tell them in terms of how to prioritize those things?
Go listen to your own employees. talk to your constituents, right? Talk to the leaders of the teams that you are building these spaces for. Understand from them, what challenges are they facing broadly? Not just challenges they're facing with space, but what are they grappling with? What are their priorities? How is their team from an engagement perspective? What is it that they need to build better collaboration within their own team? What is it that they're facing in terms of, well-being issues, burnout issues? Most workplace leaders also are facing within their own teams, right? We've managed to hit peak burnout for the third year in a row, just not good overall. And so how do you help people not only by being clear about like what your priorities are so they don't feel like they're overburdened with the nth plus one priority, but also how do you help people grow? So I'll give you a quick example. Turns out that growth is actually one of the big unlocks for burnout. If I'm asking you if I'm a workplace leader and I got somebody on my team that's done the moves recalculation 54 times, and I'm about to ask them to do it for the 55th time, and it's the 51st time in which it's a scramble, they're probably pretty burned out because they've done it before. You're asking them to do it again. If instead you can ask that of someone who hasn't done it before, who might not be quite as good at it, but get that other person to support them so that they get a break, that gets you a bonus. If you can take that person who's done moves 54 times and said, hey, I want you to take on a slightly different project that's going to stretch you, they will stretch. Both of those people, the person coming into it that's not quite up to speed on it, it's a stretch. It would normally cause stress on them, but it's a good form of stress. It's a form of stress that says, I am learning and I am expanding my capability. And so therefore, yes, I am being stretched by this, but it's not going to burn me out in the same way that asking me to do the same thing 55 times does.
You touch on a topic. I think that the work environment has become much more people-centric, human-focused, and the work that you do in the research, how you see that changing the way that we work or the work environment.
I hope that what we see is an increased understanding that a human-centric work environment is one that gets better results out of people, right? And so we know this from a workplace perspective from research that lighting, like natural lighting and biophilia and clean air and spaces for people to connect with one another, not only make people feel better, but it results in better work, right? I am cognitively more capable if I get exposure during the day to fresh air and sunlight and plants. And so there are linkages between these two in terms of well-being and productivity and engagement of teams of people that you don't get if you're simply treating them as cogs in a machine, right? And so I think part of the challenge we face today is it's a little bit tied in with AI too. I think there is a belief that not only is the job market rougher, so therefore we can treat people a little bit rougher, but also that, AI might just be able to displace some workers, so we can use that as a threat to kind of keep them in line. That's not treating people the way that any of those leaders would want to be treated themselves, right? Back to the golden rule, do unto others, you would have them do unto you. But it's also not, let's assume that we do hire adults, that we hire smart, capable people. I think we want to provide them with a better environment to operate and then expect great things out of them. And then deal with them if they're not hitting those expectations, as opposed to thinking about this as a place where we want to minimize our investments because they are interchangeable and someday we might replace them with a bot.
How about, are you seeing any emerging practices or experiments? I mean, how do organizations learn new things and begin to bring these into the work environment?
Yeah. So from an experimentation perspective, I think this is one of the places where I had to learn as I worked with more workplace people. The span of time it takes to conduct an experiment is a lot longer in some cases, right? So there are short-term experiments you can run. Zillow, Atlassian, Allstate have all done things where they've tested using spaces in different ways and tested through surveys with people subsequent, different like small scale experiments using spaces they've got today. I was talking to somebody the other day who had a space that had been done in a more modular fashion so teams could move things around, but nobody was moving stuff around. One of the things that they tried is they went into the space on a Sunday and literally just moved some of the desks so they were slightly more inconveniently located to see what would happen. And lo and behold, that little experiment taught that team that, like, I didn't know this stuff moved. And all of a sudden they started moving things around and they didn't put it back where it was before. They put it in a different configuration. And they went and talked to them and said, why'd you guys do that? Oh, well, this works much better for us. Would you do it again? Yeah, if things don't work, we'll move it again. Like, that's a very small scale experiment, right? And then PagerDuty was the one I was talking about briefly earlier. PagerDuty figured, okay, Lisa's coming up in Toronto. We have, 150-ish people in the greater Toronto area. We know they're not coming in that often. They moved from like a C to an A class building. They took about 40% of the space they had before. They redesigned it around, I think, like 25 desks, and then a big space that was very flexible where you could flex from 30 to 55 people in that space for a team gathering. And then there's some other like phone booths and small conference rooms for people to use. And that worked really well in terms of like the quality, the cost, the user expectations, people's engagement with it, the utilization of it, all the rest of it. But they also learned some things that didn't quite work as well. Some of the noise separation between those spaces wasn't great enough. They were a little shy on a couple of, not phone booths, but even small conference room type of things. They put in one for 8 and they needed more 2s and 3s. So when they did it in Lisbon, they put more soundproofing and baffling into a similar shaped space, did the same thing again, learned from that, learned some other things, then took that to Atlanta and did something different in Atlanta based on what they learned in Toronto and in Lisbon. So you can still do experimentation even on the actual literal like facility delivery side of things, because a company of that, anybody that's past 5,000 employees probably has multiple locations in the first place. Your leases probably aren't all coming up at the same time. And so how you experiment with that is a little different. And then the last one is flex space providers give you a fantastic opportunity to experiment with different spaces, different topology, different sizes, quality, cost ratios, all the rest of it. And it's just a really good way to get data more quickly. And I've worked with a number of people that have basically said, hey, any geography with less than XX people, 30, 50, whatever it is, 100, we're going to get out of the lease and we're just going to use a flex provider. And then others that have said, hey, as we're growing, we're using the flex providers to figure out what works in this area. And then once we get past, a couple hundred, we're going to go and grab a lease. But why until then wouldn't we test out what's working and see on a more flex basis?
Brian, thanks. This has been a great conversation, and I've got a lot more questions, but we're kind of running out of time. But I do want to ask you if there's anything that we've missed that you think is important to include in part of this conversation.
I think we touched on all the highlights going through all this stuff. I would love folks to, if folks want to follow up, you can follow me on LinkedIn, but also check out the Flex Index, flexindex.com, and you can also sign up for our Flex Index newsletter. Because a lot of what I hear and we hear gets shared there.
Brian, thanks. This has been a lot of fun. I appreciate you taking the time to have the conversation.
Glad to do it. Thanks, Bob.